So in order to understand where I'm coming from in terms of inclusive language, you have to know a little bit about the mission of my office. And on this slide, you got the official mission, which is to empower students to build a more inclusive, equitable, and welcoming campus environment for all members of the UHD community through programming and trainings, and by engaging in outreach and advocacy efforts to promote diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice, which is a very difficult one sentence to read in one breath. The translation, kind of a paraphrase of it, is we want to build a more and more diversity, embracing, inclusive, welcoming, safe. Thank you very much. Caffeine is important today. Affirming campus climate where all can feel welcome, and this is the hard part. Feel free to participate on equal footing as everyone else. That's difficult because many people come here never having experienced what it's like to feel free to participate on an equal footing as everyone else. And so we have to very often convince students that, yes, we really mean that when we say it. And students have the opportunity, maybe for the first time, to experience what it's like. A recent report came out that as you know, Houston is the most diverse city in the US right now, but our school system is not as diverse as the city. In fact, it's very much similar to the 1960s and even the 1950s in terms of some schools being quite segregated. And so this is where that's very, very important. And language becomes very helpful for us in accomplishing these goals. So to start out, I want you to think of a time when you witnessed somebody being verbally assaulted, verbally marginalized, verbally mocked, humiliated, and you decided that's not right. And you stepped in and you said something. And what emotions do you remember feeling as you witnessed it, as you intervened, and then afterwards? How did you feel about yourself and what you did? And were you glad that you spoke up? Can anybody think of an example? Yeah.
I remember feeling afraid to say something,
Mm-hmm.
and not knowing what the outcome would be and ramifications from my part. But when I did, I felt empowered.
Right.
Because words and the act of standing up causes a reaction.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it only takes one person to start that domino effect. And I was surprised at the end by the amount of people that stood behind me.
Right,
That
right.
were afraid to do the same thing.
Yeah.
And so on.
So common experience, even for me, and I try to step in whenever I can, is always a little fear and lack of knowing what's going to happen. But you're setting an example for others and empowering them by that example. Anyone watching on Zoom have an example they want to share? Or anybody else in the audience here? But probably each one of us can think of times that we've stepped up and said something, right? No matter what our ideological background and other aspects of who we are and what we believe, when we see something that just is not right, all of us at one time have probably stood up and said something. And then when we did, even if it was scary, and even if we weren't so sure of what we were doing, we felt good about it. And what we don't know is just how big of an effect that has on all the people who witness it, because again, you're setting an example. And that's one of the reasons we're going to be bringing a bystander intervention program to campus, hopefully this fall, so students can get trained in some techniques for how to evaluate a situation, to make sure this is going to be a safe situation to step into, and then what are some educative ways to deal with it? And when is it just something that's a little bit out of our league and we need to call for help? So that we're not just going to walk by, or like some people do, hold up the camera and make a video of it, which can be helpful if we need to be a witness. But often we need to take action. So language has a lot of power to it. Nathaniel Hawthorne said, words, so innocent and powerless as they are, as standing in a dictionary, how potent for good and evil they become in the hands of one who knows how to combine them. And if you think about it, we've seen many examples in recent years of how language can be powerful in those ways. Archbishop Desmond Tutu from South Africa, now retired, I love what he says here. And many people have said the same thing, but the way he said it just kind of gets me, because it combined with what he did in his life in helping to end apartheid in South Africa really lends a lot of power to it. He said language is very powerful. Language does not just describe reality. Language creates the reality it describes. So that even when people repeat something that others will say, wait a minute, that's not true. But it keeps getting repeated and repeated in the media, social media. It takes on a life of its own, and people will start to see it as a reality. So very briefly, some background concepts. And I got to check my watch because I'm used to speaking for 2-hour blocks, not 45 minutes. So when I mention diversity, what we mean is the wide variety of shared, different personal and group characteristics among people. So we can think of diversity as who we are. Because if we live in Houston, we live diversity every day. If we're at UHD, we live and breathe diversity every day. And inclusion, though, a lot of people don't necessarily get the distinction between diversity and inclusion. Inclusion is the intention of including people who might otherwise be excluded or marginalized. Inclusion is what we want to create. Inclusion is the hard part. Diversity, UHD is going to be diverse even without us even trying to make it diverse. But inclusion takes work, it takes effort, it takes intentionality. We have to want to make our campus more inclusive. We have to want to take the people who are on the margins and bring them to the center and give them voice. Microaggressions, if I mention these are brief micro behaviors, verbal or nonverbal, covert forms of isms, and we have that workshop on microaggressions if you want to learn more. But think of an example, a common example that students have said they've heard of. They'll go to an interview or they'll give a presentation and someone will say, wow, you're so well spoken. As if, what did they expect? That you're not going to be. Yeah, you're so articulate, as if they expected you not to be articulate. Or here's one that people in Houston get very often. Where are you from? Houston? No, where are you really from? That's a microaggression. Now, the thing about it is the person committing the microaggression doesn't mean any harm. In fact, they might be trying to give a compliment, but they're just not aware. So, you don't scold them and say, you just microaggressed. What we do if we have the opportunity is make them aware of what they said and how it sounds to us when we hear it. Speech codes. This is very important because when someone sees inclusive language, sometimes they, uh-oh, he's going to talk about political correctness and stuff like that. This is a little bit different. Speech codes are institutional rules or policies governing language use, even delineating what one can and cannot say. And some universities do this. They'll have speech codes. They'll say, you can't say these words. You can't talk about these topics unless you, in the presentation or something, unless somebody has vetted what you're going to say. We don't do that at UHD. The UH system does not use speech codes because speech codes always run headlong into the First Amendment. And in the UH system, will always lean towards freedom of speech. So we have another way to approach language, and that's what I call language responsibility. So whatever jobs we have, whether we're in the military, working in a corporation, whether teacher, we work in a gym, we work in an institution like this, anywhere we work, we have to be cognizant of the rules about what we can talk about or how we can talk about things. So think about, for example, if you work in a law office, you have to be careful about confidentiality, right? And in the military, of course, there's a lot of limitations on what you can and cannot talk about, particularly in terms of operational security. And in corporate work, there may be also limitations on what we can talk about, when, and to whom. So we never have total free speech, right? Even as citizens, you can't go into a theater, the classic example, and the theater is full and you yell, fire, because you create a panic and somebody could be hurt. So we live with limitations on our speech all the time. So language responsibility should not be any difficult concept for you at all. So when I talk about inclusive language, I mean language that does not stereotype, demean, or patronize people on the basis of gender, race, religion, ability, sexual orientation, many, many, many other factors. In other words, we don't want to hurt people by what we say. So how does inclusive language contribute to campus life at UHD? Well, we don't have speech codes, but like all universities, the U of H system has a discrimination and harassment policy. And part of which says that our business should be about maintaining and strengthening an education, working and living environment where students, faculty, staff, and visitors, here's the cool part, are free from discrimination and harassment of any kind. Can we do that? Can we totally eliminate discrimination and harassment? Yeah, we hope so. We got to try. But are we going to achieve it with perfection today? No. Or next year? Or 10 years from now? Or 50 years from now? But we keep working to get there. So we're never going to reach a point because of this language. U of H system has set it up so we can never reach a point where we say, okay, there's no more discrimination and harassment. We can move on to something else. As soon as we do that, what happens? Discrimination and harassment. Now, we don't have dormitories yet. So on our campus, the primary way that somebody would experience discrimination or harassment is through language. And the primary language that somebody might experience it through is a microaggression. So it's not even intended. So that's why taking that workshop I offer would be very helpful, because you can see the different kinds and we talk about how to respond to them. So in light of this policy, inclusive language is choosing to use language responsibly. So I'm not the language police, and we don't have any language police. I would never, even if I had the power, compel or force you to say things that I want to hear you say. So if you want to say Merry Christmas, that's your choice. Now, if I see you and you're my friend and I know you're a Christian, it's the holidays, and you're passing me in the hall and you say Merry Christmas, I'll say Merry Christmas back. But if there's other students around, I may say Happy Holidays. Why? Because there are some who may not be Christian. We have a lot of Muslim students. We have students who are atheists. So I use a term that's not going to marginalize or make them feel left out. So it's a choice. We choose to use language responsibly, which means we also evaluate the context of our situation. So if it's just you and me in the hallway, we can be more specific and use the language that applies or reflects our faith. But when we're in mixed company with other people of different faiths, out of respect for them, we choose a term that isn't going to make them feel marginalized. But I would never force somebody to do that. I would try to convince you that that's the way to go, but it's up to you. The thing is, all of us are under this policy, students, staff, and faculty. So each of us has this responsibility to make that policy actually work, even though 50 years from now, we're not going to have achieved it with perfection. 100 years from now, they're going to be doing a lot better, but still not perfect. The beauty of the way they word it is they're always going to have to keep working on it. So how can inclusive language contribute to the goal of the policy? If we're using responsible language, if we're using language responsibly, we are going to marginalize people less. We're going to stereotype less. We're also going to be aware of our own language use and think about what we're saying and where it comes from. Because often, as you know, many people will just blurt out what's on their mind, when if they really stopped and thought about what they're going to say, oops, that didn't sound very good. They would say something differently. So why is language important? Language is powerful, can have positive and negative effects. You can all think of examples where at some point you were going along just fine, you were doing well at whatever it was you're doing, and somebody says something so awful, just takes all the wind out of your sail. And just, you lose your motivation. And sometimes it's the people closest to us who can be the most cruel that way, without even intending, although some people intend. I've seen that happen. On the other hand, we all have probably had that person or some people in our lives where when we thought we couldn't do it, we couldn't achieve our goal, they said just what we needed to hear to get us to pick ourselves back up and keep trying, stay on course, and we achieved what we thought we couldn't achieve. For me, getting my PhD was my mother. Because I, like every graduate student, I was doubting myself. I thought they're going to realize any minute I don't belong here. I'm not as smart as these other students. I'm a fake. I'm not good enough. Any moment they're going to realize that. My mother kept saying, no, you are smart. You're a good writer, which you have to be a good writer in my field. You have good ideas. Quit complaining and just put your nose to the grindstone and do it. She told me that about once a week for about 6 years. And I did it. And I said, oh, I don't really have to go to the graduation march across where they put the hood over you and all this. She said, my son is getting a PhD and my son is going to go to graduation. Yes, mother? So without knowing the history of words or phrases, you may offend others unintentionally. So we have in the US, we have a lot of different regionalisms. An example, I was asked once if we could, when I was presenting to faculty, could we meet like once a week at lunch and talk about these issues? I said, sure. Now the word we would have where I grew up for having a lunchtime business meeting is brown bag lunch. You bring your lunch in a lunch bag and you work while you're eating. So I said, sure, we could do a brown bag. Now there was a faculty member who very kindly raised his hand and explained something. He was a specialist in Southern history, particularly history of Louisiana. He said, John, do you know where that word, that expression comes from? And then he explained how brown bag has this history of being connected to slavery, where if your skin was lighter than a brown bag, often you would get domestic duties, and darker, you would be doing hard physical labor outdoors. I said, I had no idea. I didn't know that. So I apologize if I offended anyone. From now on, I'll use lunch and learn. No, so it doesn't cost me anything, right? We got over 1 million words in English. I lived in Korea 6 years. They got 250,000. You don't have many choices on some words, especially when my ability was so low. But in English, we always have a more neutral way to say something. Does it cost me anything to change my choice of words in that case? No, not a thing. But one faculty member said, well, I'm going to keep using because it doesn't mean that when I use it, just kind of stubborn. She retired since then. So without being aware of hidden stereotype or an ism in what we say, we could commit a microaggression. I'll give you another example. And I always use myself as an example because I fail. I fall short. And that gets at our most important point, which I'm going to come up to. So one of my students when I was at University of Illinois he was in an African-American fraternity, and he was telling me about this event they do where the pledges will get sort of hired by sorority members to wash their car, clean their rooms, and things like this. And this was like 1990. This was way back. I said, oh, like the old slave auction, which is the old term that was used for it. And as I said it, I thought, oh, that was really awful, wasn't it? I'm so sorry. And he laughed. He said, no, you're cool. I know you didn't mean any harm. I said, I never even thought about it. That old term that was in my head because we internalize language and we use it sometimes automatically. And I immediately heard what I said. And it was a microaggression, but I caught it immediately. And I apologized. I said, I won't say, I'm going to push that to my list of do not use. And he thought it was funny, but it was embarrassing. But it's an example, even when we want to try to be the best we can at this, we make mistakes. So language shapes and reflects thinking. Others will judge you by your language. Have you ever been judged by the way you speak? Or have you ever witnessed other people judged by the way they speak? Anyone on Zoom have an example of where you've been judged by your speech? Anyone typing?
No.
Okay. Anyone have an example they want to share? Yeah. So who's your stay? So from Indiana to Georgia.
And that's because I never realized, I guess they never realized that we coming from up north. I didn't have that southern accent.
Right.
As it's called. Not because it's right, southern accent.
Yeah.
And then, okay, but when I went back to Indiana in high school, we talk so country. Because I had to develop that country accent.
Right. And notice they don't say you have a southern accent, you talk so country.
So country. Not
Yeah.
southern accent. That's one thing that I did notice is that the white people had southern accents.
Right.
But black people don't.
Yeah.
But we all sounded the same.
But interesting that there's a distinction attached. There's a history to that. Yeah. So that's a great example. Now, where I grew up, if I have a couple glasses of wine, or if I'm really tired, or I get agitated, you'll hear my home dialect come up, which sounds Canadian. So when I was coaching the powerlifting team and I had to yell at somebody for doing something wrong, because you can get killed in powerlifting with those weights, they could always tell if I was serious or if I was bluffing, because if I was serious, I sounded Canadian, and they'd kind of chuckle and say, what's so funny? They'd say that again. It's funny. So we get judged by how we speak. And we've all seen examples where people get judged in cruel ways. You're in line at an HEB or something like that, and a young mother is speaking to her kids in Spanish, and she could be a 5th or 6th generation Harris County resident. And somebody, an Anglo in front of me will look at me. They always look at me. I wish these people would learn English before they come here. If you take my inclusive language course, I'll tell you how to handle that situation. But I get that one a lot. So the power of language, one factor that makes a word or phrase powerful is connotation. So every word has a denotation. So this is a podium. That's just what it means. Podium means something like this. But where words get power is their connotation, the baggage that's attached to them. And, to be very quick, there's probably no more culturally loaded, baggage-laden word in American English than what we call the N-word, which I cannot, my watch is talking to me, which I can't say. I heard my stepfather when I was a little kid in the 60s say that word. He was about 50 years old, much older than my mother. And I asked my mother, what does mean? And what I got was, psh, don't ever say that again. But he said it, psh, don't ever say it again. So it was a taboo word, right? It's got a history. It's got a history that cannot be removed from it. And so there's a lot of controversy even among those who use the term. So I want to give you some examples of some other words that reflect some connotations. So think of these: hit like a girl, faggot, which I heard a lot growing up. And until I came out as a wrestler in college, I didn't get called that anymore. She was asking for it. Illegals. I hate that word. We did a poster program with several other universities, about 15 across the United States and Canada some years ago. We're going to do it again. But this is one of the softball players from Shippensburg University. She says, I don't say hit like a girl because my gender doesn't limit my athletic ability. I guarantee I'm twice her size, but she could probably hit twice as well as I can, even correcting for my age. This is one of our power lifters. I don't say faggot because it's a dehumanizing insult. People should be valued for their character, not rejected because of their sexual orientation. So people throw that word around all the time, not thinking about the connotations and the damage, the harm it does. And when you call them on it, they'll say, well, that's not what I meant. It doesn't matter. When there's connotations, you cannot remove the connotations and then it means what you want it to mean. The connotations stay with it all the time. I don't say she was asking for it because a woman's appearance does not equal consent to any form of physical or sexual abuse. That one speaks for itself. Illegals is a word that I really detest. It's not grammatical. It's a nominalized adjective. And it is the most dehumanizing word that we have in reference to people who are undocumented. These are migrants. Migrants are people, right? Illegals are a thing. And throughout human history, bad things happen when we dehumanize others. And so when we did this poster, we went out to find the biggest, nastiest, ugliest looking mug we could put on a poster. And this is who we found. And he said, because it's a word that utterly strips hardworking people of their humanity instead of recognizing them for who they are, our brothers and sisters, our friends and neighbors, our students and fellow Gators. Everyone deserves to be treated as part of the human family. Now, do I take a position on the issue of undocumented migration in that statement? No. I just say people need to be treated as family. We need to treat people as people. And yet this was one of the most marked up posters that we put up. But the people who marked it up didn't look around because there's always a camera pointed right at it. So I got to have a discussion with each of them, not to get them in trouble, but to get them to think. So how do we keep our language inclusive? Educate yourself. Know where terminology that you use comes from and what message your language conveys. Be aware of connotations. Stay on topic. Don't single somebody out because of some feature of their identity, especially when they're the only member of that group who's in your discussion. Validate the reactions of others. So what you might not find offensive might be extremely offensive to someone else. And if somebody says they're offended, being offended is an emotion, right? We cannot disagree with an emotion. We can disagree with a point of view, with an argument, that sort of thing. But if somebody feels bad, we have to validate it, because that's not up for discussion or disagreement. People feel what they feel. Use the preferred name that a person indicates, or the preferred pronouns that a person indicates. Some people get very upset about this, but if I ask someone, would you mind sharing with me what pronouns you prefer? They appreciate it because they know I care enough to ask. And it doesn't cost me a thing to use those pronouns. If you're not sure what pronoun to use they, them, their. That's perfectly acceptable nowadays. If you want to learn more about this, take my inclusive language workshop. What does gendered language look like? You know, we say yes, sir, no, sir. So when I introduce somebody, I'll say, I'd like to welcome everybody. So I just avoid the yes, sir, no, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, that sort of thing altogether. Group addresses, gendered descriptors, we call ships she for some reason. I don't know why. Some of my friends that have big four-wheel drives, some call their truck a she or a he. I call it an it, it's a truck. And pronouns. So remember, in working towards inclusive language, how you think or believe a person should be identified is secondary to how they want to be identified. That's validating somebody's identity. It doesn't cost us a thing. So, most important point, it's okay to make mistakes. We're going to use non-inclusive language no matter how hard we try, because we're human and we make mistakes. We apologize. We make an example for others by doing that, and others are going to appreciate our awareness and effort. And we improve through practice and a lifelong commitment to educating ourselves about these issues. Okay, so hopefully we got time for a question or two. So sorry to squeeze so much in such a short time. I'm used to a 2-hour presentation. 45 minutes. Are there any questions? Yeah. I send out on our Facebook page, on our Twitter feed, and on our Instagram, beginning of every month, I put a schedule for the month, which is tentative because a lot of stuff comes up. But every Monday, I send out to all students a list of workshops for that week, along with the Zoom link. And you can start anytime. There's no order that you have to take the workshops. You just have to join one and start, and you're on your way. Did you have a question? Okay.
Well, I get the email for the workshop. And I think I saw that, like, pretty much covered exactly what is the workshop. Because I saw the emails for the workshop, but I never really understood what they were for.
Okay. So if you can, there's a link on those emails that takes you to a page on my office webpage that explains the whole program. It's the Gator Leader Diversity Leadership Program. And when you complete the required workshops and then you write a short paper, you get a certificate of completion. Now, it doesn't give you credit, and it's an in-house thing, but a lot of students have told me that in their job interviews, they will comment on that certificate, because a lot of small companies in particular want to do something regarding diversity and inclusion, but they can't hire somebody like me full time. They need people within, employees within the company who have some experience and knowledge to start it. And so that's been a plus for many of our students who've completed the program. It adds value to your degree. Any questions online? Other questions?
I'd like to make a statement.
Sure.
One of my favorites, if you have your favorites, one of mine is speaking to someone over the phone
Mm-hmm.
and then coming in contact with them. And they say, man, you don't sound, you don't look how you sound.
Yeah.
So what do I look like?
What was I supposed to look like? Yeah. And that's an example of people judging by language, and we do it all the time. Even when we try not to, we'll still have those images in our head.
Right.
But if we're aware, we just keep them in our head. And don't let them control us. We take control of them. That's connected to our unconscious bias workshop. So thank you for attending today. I hope you learned something. And if you can come to one of our regular Gator Leader workshops, you'll get the whole shebang on these topics. They're very, very important. And by getting that knowledge, you become an agent of change, not just on campus, but in your family, in your work, and life in general. So we need that very, very much. So thanks everybody who came here, and thanks everyone on Zoom. It's a pleasure to talk to you. If you ever want to come down and see the Center for Diversity and Inclusion, it's South 37, kind of straight down the hallway across from the bookstore. We got a lot of DVDs, books, other resources, and a lounge you can hang out in if you're on campus. But be on the lookout for our schedule of workshops. All right. So thanks very much.